That's heaps sick, eh?
Hi all. I'd like to have a go at making a video covering a few notes on tuning the engine in a classic Jaguar. I'm aiming for this video to become an addendum to a fantastic series by Adam from Living with a Classic, who already covers this subject in wonderful detail. Adam's videos detail the series of steps that you must do prior to touching your carburetors. These steps aren't optional. If you don't have good compression, correct valve clearance, and properly set up ignition, you won't get anywhere at all. But if after following all the steps listed in his videos and in the workshop manual, you find that your car still isn't running well, this video may be for you. So what I'd like to do is offer you an additional step concerning vacuum leaks and checking manifold pressure, as well as some techniques and opinions that I have formed in the last few months of tuning my 1966 Jaguar 420. So I followed Adam's videos and found that although my car ran much better, it still wasn't perfect, and it took me some time to work out why this was. Primarily, I found that the results of tuning my carbs weren't as you might expect. I still had erratic running, a stumbling, splashy idle, and generally just a poor running engine. I don't claim to be an expert, but this video is one that I needed to see 6 months ago, and it may be of some help to you too. Even back then, I knew that I had vacuum issues, but there were leaks from several places and I failed to pick them all up. So in these two videos, I'm going to give you both the theory and the practical techniques to sort these out. This video will cover the theory, and I've got a few parts in the mail that I need before we get out to the car in the next one. I'm going to throw a few graphs at you, but stay with me and we'll get through this together. Oh, that's my needle. So the first thing we need to know is that flow rate equals vacuum times a constant. In a perfect world, that constant would be controlled by the opening of your throttle only. Forgetting dashpot oils and springs, SU carburetors only have one means of controlling air-fuel ratio at a given throttle opening, and that is the taper of the fuel needle. This taper is set to match the fuel air demands of the engine, and it is directly related to the slope of this line here. What happens when we introduce a vacuum leak is the unmetered air essentially adjusts the slope of this line. So the airflow into the engine no longer matches what the carb is able to provide in fuel to maintain proper AFR. This isn't as large of an issue on other carburetors because most have additional adjustments of fueling at different throttle openings. I'm a bike guy, so I have experience with key and flat slides. They have many adjustments, main and slow fuel, main and slow air, emulsion tube. Then they have the tapered needle as we know it, as well as clip position, which is functionally like our jet position settings. So to an extent, they can tune for this effect by adjusting fueling to make up for leaks, whereas we can't. The next graph is a graph of fuel-air ratio over a range of throttle openings. Just grab this. So I promise you this graph doesn't look so clean in reality, but allow me some leniency to get the point across here. In a perfect world, the taper of the needle will deliver your target air-fuel ratio with adjustments on either side of this line directly correlated to adjustments in your fuel mixture screw. Introducing an unmetered vacuum leak into this system works to create a slope on this line, meaning that when you tune the carb at idle, you will find that the car runs much too lean at higher throttle openings, and conversely, if you tune for best running at speed, it will be much too rich at idle. Hopefully this graph shows why SU carburetors are especially susceptible to this. This is exactly the problem that I had with my Jaguar. I'll also mention that there's an argument to be made that the stock needle will introduce a slope in this system anyway because they were selected for economical running to begin with, and fuel has changed a lot since 1966. I have a UE needle here, which is 2 steps richer, and it is a suggested upgrade, but I promise you that for most intents and purposes, you won't notice an effect great enough to cause issues with a stock needle. If you want to look, if you want to look further into this, there are some great online resources on needle choice in an XK engine. I'd last like to characterize the vacuum advance system in our cars. Whoop, wrong way. So 420XK engines take a ported vacuum signal from before the throttle butterfly that should be 0 when the throttle is closed. It then shoots up at part throttle openings to roll back the timing of the spark. It does this to ensure complete combustion from weaker fuel mixtures at part throttle cruising. It then returns to 0 when wide open to prevent spark knock and strong fuel mixtures. The movement from manifold vacuum to this ported system is an interesting topic, but to summarise it, they did it for emissions control. What this means for us is that we can't only use the ported signal for the diagnostic test that we're going to use in the next video. Now, I tried to find figures for what vacuum the engine should be pulling in the manifold at idle, and while I couldn't find figures for a 4.2 litre engine, I did find figures for the 3.8 litre engine from a Mark II. This graph is the vacuum advance curve, and while the vacuum will increase with higher RPM cruising, it won't increase by much. It turns out that the engine should be pulling between 54 and 67 kPa through the manifold ported idle. Now, if your engine is vacuum leaking badly enough, it will move the vacuum advance to a steeper slope of the curve, where smaller variations in vacuum will result in larger variations of spark advance, which will produce a slightly wandering spark timing and further variations in vacuum. It's a bit of a feedback loop, and the result is the car doesn't run as well as it should. Part throttle economy and throttle response being the two big victims here. So, what are the symptoms of a lean running car? I've experienced all of these, but slowly I've solved them all as I've eliminated leaks, and there were several. The first and most serious is overheating. So when I first got the car, it would run bloody hot, and if left unchecked, this will slowly destroy the engine. I think I'm lucky. The only issue I saw was exhaust valve clearances that had closed up quite a bit from the heat. And in the 4,000 kilometres since I've sorted this out, they haven't moved a bit. Interestingly, they'd installed an electric pusher fan to combat this, and I've since removed it. I live in Brisbane, Australia, and it's bloody hot here, and I can crawl in city traffic with no issues anymore. The next symptom is surging, so you'll feel changes in the engine's power at cruising, and you'll have much less power to begin with. Backfiring through the intakes when you floor the throttle. This has several causes, not just fueling. Dash pod oil and timing being the two big ones. But for me, this was also a result after having tuned a leaking engine with the lift test on Adam's video. After tuning for idle, it was much too lean at higher throttle openings. Running out of adjustment. If you have a really bad leak, you may find that no matter how rich you set up your carb, it still stalls out on the piston lift test. You may also have difficulty getting the car to idle at all. My car wouldn't idle below 1000 RPM previously, and finally popping through the exhaust, but be careful with this one because exhaust leaks and rich running will also cause this. I haven't mentioned the condition and working order of the carbs to begin with, and I'm going to direct you to Adam's video for that. The good news is all of this is fixable. I'm going to do my best to show you how. So why are these issues happening in the first place? The biggest issue is age. So rubber components don't age well after decades in your car engine bay. Quite often they'll split and leak, and all three vacuum takeoffs were leaking on my 420. One that goes to the brake booster and one that feeds the cabin air controls, the last being to my vacuum advanced diaphragm. I've also had a leak at the block from an incorrectly installed intake manifold on a pair of studs that were too long. So in tightening up the bolts on the manifold, you were actually running out of thread, and that was the resistance you were feeling. Ask me how long it took to find that one out. So if you're experiencing these symptoms, there's actually a really easy way to check this. So I paid 40 Australian dollars for this vacuum pump, and we're going to use it for two things. Firstly, we're going to inspect the vacuum takeoffs by applying a vacuuming and seeing if the system holds or if it leaks. And secondly, we're going to use it to measure the vacuum pulled by the engine at idle as a clue to if there is an issue elsewhere. So your intake manifold or throttle butterfly is not being properly closed, for example, because remember our ported vacuum signal should be 0 at idle. I'm then going to show you an easy way to find the source of any leaks downstream in the vacuum circuit. After all that, I'd like to show you my take on the piston lift test, just because I have 1 or 2 extra notes on Adam's video. I'm confident that if you're having these issues, you can go straight back to his video and you'll have a bit more luck. So in the next video, we're going to get out to the car and get into it. So guys, I actually just remembered that I had an old Lucas distributor sitting on the shelf in the shed. And maybe what we can talk about here is why it's sitting on the shelf in the shed. So we can make a start on the practical here in a moment. So these are really interesting devices. They're kind of, prior to the age of computers, it's just interesting how they did things. So there's two elements in this distributor that work to advance the spark in the Jaguar engine. The first is the centrifugal advance mechanism. Let's move that out of the way. So as the engine speeds faster and faster, the weights underneath that plate will actually expand, and then it's hard to show it on camera, but they actually expand, and then it will move the rotor arm, which effectively advances the timing. So this is your RPM centrifugal advance. That's actually not what we're going to talk about here. So the second part is the vacuum advance canister on the side here. So when that ported vacuum signal is sent to the distributor, it actually, let's just hook this up here and I'll show you. This is on the vacuum pump I just showed you. So when we apply a vacuum to this, that bottom plate starts turning. Can you see that? Which effectively advances the spark at part throttle openings. There's a reason that this isn't in the car anymore. So maybe when this is in the car, this is very easy to do. So you'll just replace where your ported vacuum signal goes into here with this. And what we're looking for is that the car holds vacuum, or that the diaphragm there holds vacuum. And you can see that this one does. That's not the only part to this story. So there is a table in the manual here which gives you a list of pressures applied, or vacuums applied to this canister, and the associated increase in what would you call it? The associated increase in degrees timing on your crankshaft. This is a little bit tricky to actually do in the car, so I would suggest taking it out. There's plenty of guides online on how to put them back in. They're not hard, but I'm going to show you something really tricky as to how we can easily actually measure this to see where it's at using this and a pair of calipers. They're over on the desk in there, but I'll get into the computer in a moment and I'll show you what we're talking about. Remember too, I've actually just scribed a little mark into the side of that plate to line up with this, and that's going to come in handy in a moment. So if I release that, it should do that. Let's see how they're both lined up. If I go back onto the computer, I'll show you what I'm talking about in a moment. See you soon. So we're in a program now called Fusion 360, and this may not make a lot of sense now, but hopefully it will by the end of this. So I'll draw your attention to the two circles here that we're starting with. So that inner circle there, that matches the diameter of that rotary plate that moves under vacuum. Now this outer one here corresponds to the inner diameter of the outer casing. Now if you'll remember, we put two witness marks, one here and one here. Now, if we go through and look at the ignition distributor test data table in the manual, it gives us 5 different vacuum readings and the associated degrees in crankshaft advance that we might expect to see. Now, because the distributor moves at half of the revolutions that the crankshaft does, we can double those values and import them into these two circles and then work out how much, work out the distance between those two witness marks. And then we can use that to determine if the vacuum advance canister is functioning as it should. Now, this last little wedge here, they are wedges, by the way, because it gives you a range. It doesn't give you one set value. These are mechanical devices, and they do vary a bit under the conditions that you give them. But for 20 inches of mercury, we might expect to see between 7 and 9 degrees of crankshaft advance, which would correspond to 14 and 18 degrees of advance at the distributor. Now, if we take these, if we zoom in here and we take the distance between these two lines here, we go inspect this one here. So that's 7.6 millimeters, and the other one, this one here, is 10.8 millimeters. So if we come back with a value between those two distances, then we know that the distributor is functioning as it should for an advanced level at 20 inches of mercury. Oh my God. All right, so let's go back outside and measure that and see how we're looking. Okay, the keen-eyed among you may have noticed I just messed that up. So I was actually looking at the wrong line. I'd selected this little joint here, which is for a different wedge. So our golden numbers are 8.7 at the lower end and 10.6 at the upper end. So let's go out there and measure that now. So guys, I've gone and pulled these numbers out of our sketch there. And I'll also mention too, I'm not much of a mathematician, but with the something hypotenuse approaching the base edge, as it gets shorter and shorter, it gets much harder to stay accurate. So I'm really only looking for these three as confirmation of what this thing's doing. So if we start at 20 inches of mercury, let's go to that. Okay, 20 inches. Let's have a measure. .45, so not quite where we need to be here. Let's have a look at another one. Go to 13, 11, 12, 13, there. .15. Now, we go to 9. The measure of that. 5.41. So we can see that it is achieving I know in the lower levels it also moves as well. I won't show that here, but it's achieving something up to a certain point, and then it's just not going any further, which is very characteristic of an old unit like this. So certainly an interesting thing to know. I mean, it got terrible fuel economy before I changed this out. I now run a digital 123 ignition, and it's one of the best things I've ever put in the car. I know people certainly stay attached to their old technology like this, but yeah, you can buy these new vacuum canisters, so keep that in mind, and yeah. Alright, so that's where I'll leave this one. And these are the figures pulled from a 22D6 distributor running the 4106A advanced curves, which is stock Jaguar 420 from 1966. Now these days I run different curves in the 123 distributor, but that's bone stock. So if you want to have a go at this yourself, they're the figures that you need, and yeah, I'll see you next time.